Anita went missing and we hadn't heard from her, every time the phone would ring, we would hope and pray it was her, and it never was.
And that's when panic started. They all felt something was wrong. It was devastating.
When the fire department arrived at the scene, they found out they had a cadaver in the field. It was very obvious that her throat had been slit.
I received a call from a woman who said her ex-husband came home one night around that time frame covered in blood. This is the lead I'm looking for.
We were worried about Anita. We wanted to know what happened to her. She would have tried to contact someone, especially her mother.
In the 60s, we were in the middle of the hippie generation. Huntington Beach was the fastest growing city in the United States. We would attract kids from all over the country. We had Hollywood close by and that whole thing. There were all these little cultish kinds of juvenile groups and some very devious people in Huntington Beach at that point in time.
Two miles away from the surf and sand of Huntington Beach, three boys make a grim discovery.
It was a Thursday afternoon. Officer Tom Quick responded from the Huntington Beach Police Department regarding a woman that was found in a plowed farm field near Newlyn and Yorktown. He was discovered by three young boys that were playing in that plowed field, and they thought at first she could be a mannequin. The fire department responded and found a obviously deceased female face down in a ditch in that field.
The first guys on the scene knew they had a homicide. There's no doubt about that. She was young, 20s to 30s. She was covered with a lot of blood, but it was very obvious that her throat had been slit. It was a very nasty wound that went across both jugulars and the windpipe.
It appears she's been sexually assaulted. Police know how this victim was killed, but not who she is.
No purse, no wallet, and no identification was ever found for her. She was dressed as if she was going out. She had a leather jacket, black loafer shoes, purple capri pants that were pulled up but not secure. She had a flowered blouse that had been torn open.
All the clothing, there were no tags. There was no identifying anything. So the prime question is, who is she?
Anita was born on March 9th, 1942 in Augusta, Maine. She had 6 brothers and sisters. She was pretty rambunctious. Anita was a really good aunt. She was really nice to us and would play games with us.
Everybody enjoyed being around her, had fun with her.
Growing up in small-town Augusta, Maine, the P2 brothers and sisters were part of a tight-knit family.
When I knew that Anita was coming over, I would be really happy to see her because I knew that we would get a chance to talk and have some time together.
Anita P2 is 26 in 1968, with a fun-loving and rebellious spirit.
Anita was a very outgoing person, very outspoken, bubbly.
She liked to laugh and tell jokes. Anita really liked music and going out dancing, and she liked the Beatles. She had a bit of a wild side. And Maine was pretty low-key, pretty boring. People in the 50s and 60s, when they graduated high school, would either go work at the mills or the factories or work at a restaurant or shops that were around. Anita got a job waitressing at a local restaurant, and she stayed there for a little while. Then she would get another waitress job wherever she could.
At one of her jobs, Anita makes some new friends with exciting plans to get out of their small town and head for California.
Being from Maine, California always sounds, nice weather and lots of fun and different atmosphere and nice big cities, and we just didn't have that in Maine. And that's why she wanted to go out there. It was a big deal for her mom that she was going to California. That seemed like so far away. Her family really didn't want her to go. They didn't know how safe it was going to be.
The investigators realize now that they're working with Jane Doe, a victim that is unidentified.
When you don't know who the victim is, it's exponentially more difficult because you have no starting place.
The crime scene also presents challenges to investigators.
The crime scene was in a wide open agricultural area, little chance of anybody who's seen much of anything. What we had is a muddy, plowed up field that had had heavy rain the night before that had started early. The officers noticed tire tracks in and out of the field. They were very obvious because of the rain.
There was evidence that a car had traveled onto that plowed field and made a complete circle, and it had stopped on the top of the ditch area where this victim was found. It was apparent that she had been dragged from the passenger side of that car.
What I was doing is I was kneeling down to get an oblique look at these tire tracks that had been left there by the suspect car. The officers immediately cast those with plaster of Paris so they could be matched to a suspect tire if the suspect vehicle could be found at a later time.
Next, investigators methodically searched the area where the victim was found.
The grid search at the scene is almost mandated today, not so much back in that time. There was a lot of stuff collected, and one of those items was a cigarette butt that was very close to where it appeared the body dump had taken place.
While a team catalogs physical evidence, investigators look for other ways to identify their Jane Doe victim.
The investigators had flyers made up, and they had drawings of the young lady, our victim, and then sent them out to every investigative agency they could think of.
The police department in Huntington Beach contacted 1,100 residents, had 225 contacts with either potential suspects or those who may have info, and 10,000 all-point bulletins were distributed throughout 13 of the 50 states. There was a theory that she got picked up at a bar. Every beer bar, cocktail lounge, business establishment was contacted.
One individual identified her as a patron of his bar. and that she was a regular who came by from time to time. Everybody's elated. We finally have a lead.
For our Jane Doe, there was a bartender that recognized her picture, and the bartender said, yeah, she comes in here.
What at first looked like a solid lead soon crumbles.
The bartender calls and says, I hate to tell you this, but it wasn't her because she just came in the bar today. It was disappointing. We still had the physical evidence. We had the clothing of the victim, but the only thing that developed from her clothing at the time were the loafers she was wearing. Our guys traced those back to a small manufacturing company in upstate New York someplace and found out that they were sold on kind of a regional basis. So that was, something to keep in the back of our mind. It might well be that she was from that area.
The chance of a swift conclusion to the case is dashed. The autopsy confirms that the victim had been viciously assaulted and raped.
We were dealing with a slash wound that did all of the damage in one fell swoop. It wasn't like multiple stabbings that you get where there's that emotional reaction of a lover's quarrel. No, I would assume that she had very little notice that something fatal was going to take place.
I can't think of a worse way to have your life taken. You've been raped, you've been beaten, and a knife comes to your throat and takes your life. The one interesting thing was that her toxicology levels, she had no alcohol or drugs in her system. That sort of takes you away from her having a drink with the person that ultimately took her life.
Anita wrote a letter to my grandmother. That is the envelope that the letter that she sent came in. She said she was doing well in California. She really liked the weather, and that she had taken a trip to Hollywood to see the stars' homes. She was living with this woman who had 2 boys. She was working at a restaurant, and she really liked it. She said that she was dating someone who was a long-haul truck driver, and he had been taking her with him sometimes. Anita said that she was going to write in a couple of weeks and send pictures. And this was the only letter that we ever got from her. We started getting worried about Anita when we didn't receive any other letters after that. So we started trying to contact her. The address on the envelope was Whittier. So my uncle decided to contact the police and have them do a check on her at that address. When police got to the house was abandoned. The house looked like it was a commune that a lot of people lived in because they left a lot of stuff in the house, but nobody's there. And that's all we knew. My uncle filed a police report, a missing persons report. He also tried to contact the hospitals, mental institutions, shelters, any place that he thought that she might be. Then the family wanted to try to figure out a way to get to California to see if we could find Anita. But we didn't have the money to do that. In 1968, there was no internet, there wasn't cell phones, so it was really hard to locate people back then.
Months pass without so much as a call from Anita. The silence takes a toll on her mother.
It really affected her mom. She was a very sad woman after that. And every time the phone would ring, she would hope and pray it was her, and it never was.
Unaware of Anita's family's search, police in California take an unusual step in hopes of identifying this Jane Doe.
They had an open morgue showing where anybody could come down there and look at her body.
And so she was kept for an unusually long time at the coroner's office with the body under refrigeration. No one was able to identify the body.
After 15 months, investigators run out of hope. The unnamed murder victim is unceremoniously buried, and the case goes as cold as the winter winds of Maine.
It was kind of confusing growing up, listening to all the stories, and then my mom and her brothers and sisters trying to figure out what happened to Anita.
Over the years, Lori conducts her own investigation.
Once I got older and had gone to college, computers had just come out. My dad asked me to try to find her. So I contacted America's Most Wanted and the Salvation Army missing persons. Everybody wrote back and said that they couldn't find anything on her. So I contacted Social Security, and a couple of months later, I received a letter back. Her Social Security number hadn't been used since 1968. I mean, you need it for a job, so if she's working, that would have shown up. I kind of started figuring if Anita hadn't used her Social Security number, then she probably wasn't alive. Family members started getting older and having health issues. Anita's mother, my grandmother, was getting sick, and she ended up passing away in 1996. I wanted her to know where Anita was before she passed away, but that didn't happen.
She was just baffled that she never got resolution, never heard from Anita. Very confused, very saddened. She was very depressed, especially as she got older.
After Anita's mother passes away, Anita's niece Lori enlists her teenage daughter Dakota to help search for Aunt Anita. Together they find a Jane Doe website dedicated to finding missing persons.
It was amazing how many people were also on there for the same reason, looking for loved ones and trying to find out information. And my daughter found someone that looked like Anita. We just thought, how many people are going to look like that? I contacted Whittier Police to see if they could help me figure out if that was her. And they told me they didn't have time to do that, and that I would have to contact a private investigator and have them look it up. But we didn't have the money to do that, so that wasn't an option for us.
The family's search hits a dead end. Across the country in California, a new detective reopens the Jane Doe investigation.
I dug the case file out in late 2000 and began reviewing it. There wasn't a lot to go on at the time because there were no eyewitnesses to this. I was apprehensive and even somewhat worried that it would never get solved. This was the only cold case I worked where we didn't know who the victim was, which made it that much more difficult. Eventually, I went to our crime lab where we dug the evidence out on Jane Doe's case. Going through the evidence, we found the cigarette butt as well as her clothing. I asked the technician to see if there could be some DNA extracted to put into CODIS, which is a combined DNA index system. He was able to locate both male DNA from the cigarette butt and Jane Doe's DNA from her article of clothing. Both of those were put into the system, hoping to get a match. After a couple of days, I heard from the technician that there was no match. It was disappointing to me. You want that magic bullet that's going to identify everybody.
It's now 2002, 34 years after the murder. And after striking out with the DNA, Detective Mack changes tactics.
That's when I reached out to the media, asking them to run the story again, trying to generate interest and jog somebody's memory. Homicide is a business of long shots. If you don't take the long shot, you're not going to get the results.
The media coverage generates a lead to a potential suspect living 148 miles north of Huntington Beach.
I received a call from a woman that lived in Bakersfield who said her ex-husband, who was a bartender at a seafood restaurant / tiki bar in town, came home one night around that time frame covered in blood. That really got me excited. So my partner and I jumped in our cars and drove up to Bakersfield to interview her. She gave me all the information I needed to identify him. I ran his background, found that he had committed a murder once before up in LA County. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. I'm thinking, this is the path I need. This is going to take me to the guy. When the woman called from Bakersfield and told me about her ex-husband who was a bartender in town, I remembered that there was speculation by the detectives in 1968 that Jane Doe could have met her attacker in a bar and that they left together. The connection between a bartender at a business in town and a dead girl in town caught my interest. So I found out where he lived. I did a lot of late-night surveillances on his residence, trying to see what he did. He's 34 years older or so at the time, but I still want to know who he was.
Detective Mack decides to get a DNA sample from this new suspect so he can test it against the DNA recovered from the cigarette butt.
So I sat out in front of his house until he put his trash at the curb. I went and took the bag of trash out of his trash can, took it back to the police department, had the DNA section go through it. They found some drinking straws in there, and they were able to get male DNA, but not enough to make a comparison.
Mac's partner takes a more direct approach.
He decided to just go knock on the guy's door and talk to him. He was very cooperative with them, submitted his DNA, which ultimately led to him being cleared. And he was no longer the focus of any investigation.
Over the years, investigators routinely check their DNA profile of the suspect to see if there is a match in the national database. There's no hit. The identity of Jane Doe also remains a mystery.
We have a suspect that's unidentified. We have a victim that's unidentified. And hopefully one will lead to the other.
By 2011, a new DNA technique emerges that gives investigators hope.
Familial searching and genetic genealogy are avenues for DNA investigation. Genetic genealogy is the use of DNA testing to assist in identifying blood relatives. The more DNA you have in common, the closer related you are.
They begin by looking for Jane Doe's relatives.
You're looking for a first-degree relative, a father, a brother, or a son, and that's the way familial works.
Compared to basic DNA testing, the familial method requires a relatively higher amount of high-quality DNA.
The technology that's used for genetic genealogy is called SNP technology. It stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. So when a SNP profile is developed, they look at over 100,000 of these single points on your DNA. So you can look at genetic traits, disease risk, ancestry. It says everything about a person. We wanted to do the SNP testing, but we needed a lot of DNA for it to work. We had a lot of the suspect DNA remaining from her sexual assault kit, but Jane Doe was a little bit bigger of a problem.
There was not enough DNA material from the victim to send out for a SNP profile.
The investigators need another source for Jane Doe's DNA in order to finally determine her identity.
So the next stop was to see if we can get it directly from her body. And we thought, well, we could exhume the body, but it's going to be a long shot. The more time you let pass, the more degraded the body and the skeleton's going to be. But we thought it was our only option. So we got to the cemetery. We saw that she was buried in a wooden coffin, and it was just reduced to splinters. And her skeleton was exposed. I was a little bit disappointed to see the condition of the skeleton, but we were able to use her femurs to send out for testing. Testing skeletonized tissue is a very time-consuming process. So after it was submitted to the laboratories, we were just waiting.
As detectives await the results, they look for a familial link to the killer.
We sent suspect DNA out for a SNP profile, which was then uploaded into the family tree DNA database.
They discover several matches that could lead them to their suspect.
You get a candidate list of potential relatives to your suspect. Now you have to start building trees. So we had all these trees printed out, huge legal-sized paper taped together in big sheets. So we found the common thread of a marriage in the family that produced 4 sons. They're all second cousins to the relative we found in the database. They're the right generation, and they're about the right age. This is it. We found them. The killer is one of these 4 brothers.
I got a text from Jody saying, I think it's one of these guys. I was excited. Now we had to methodically decide which of the brothers it potentially could be. It was imperative to do whatever we could to obtain DNA samples from each of the brothers.
The test results show that the killer is almost certainly Larry, Danny, Michael, or Johnny Crisco.
The 4 males, they all had some connection to California in the 1960s. So the first process was looking at criminal histories, and you're obviously looking at the age that they would be at the time of the murder. You know, are they alive? Are they deceased? And unfortunately, there was only 1 living brother, and there were 3 that were deceased. The first thought is, how are we going to get DNA evidence from deceased potential suspects? Do they have any children that we might be able to obtain DNA? Or is there an autopsy that might have some tissue samples? It was a daunting task.
You just play the hand of the cards you're dealt. So you have 1 living suspect, you have 3 deceased suspects. What do? And you develop a game plan to figure out which one it is.
Detective Deer King looks for a way to get a DNA sample from Danny Crisco, the only brother still living in 2019. He starts by staking out the man's home.
There was this 3-day surveillance, and ultimately we got trash outside the house and ran it back to the Orange County DA's office, who have this rapid instrument. And then at 3 in the morning, I get a call from my supervisor and said, it's not the suspect.
The living brother was eliminated as a potential suspect. And now we knew that one of the 3 deceased brothers had to be the killer.
There was only 1 brother that had an autopsy. We were able to secure those tissue samples, and that eliminated him.
Investigators learned the 3rd brother, Michael, was stationed in Vietnam at the time of Jane Doe's murder. So he's crossed off the suspect list.
And that left the last brother. Johnny Crisco had to be the killer of Jane Doe.
We were able to get archived, microfilmed copies of his criminal history. He had a whole wide variety of different arrests, from minor traffic stuff all the way to mayhem and child molestation. He was arrested at age 16 for morals or a statutory rape charge. Also, he was married 3 times, and he was living in Orange County for over a year, which would have been through the time of the homicide. But we had to have concrete proof. And so our thought was, how can we get a DNA sample from him? He's been cremated. There was not an autopsy. But he did have cancer.
And we found that he had a medical procedure in 2007, and there was a biopsy taken. We called the hospital, and the hospital administrator said we shouldn't have any samples for him. We don't keep samples this long. And we asked, please just go and look. And she called back and said, oh my gosh, we have a sample for this guy. Yep, you can have it. DNA testing biopsy samples is actually very complicated. They're preserved in formaldehyde and then placed in a paraffin wax. So it was another challenge that our lab had to go through.
technicians succeed in extracting stable, high-quality DNA from the biopsy tissue.
And using that, we were able to develop a profile that matched our crime scene. Finally, after 52 years, we have a name of the person that killed this unnamed victim. So obviously the question that we were looking into is, where did Johnny meet the victim?
We made it to the finish line. We were able to identify Jane Doe's killer. And it's exciting. We know who committed this murder.
Further investigation places Johnny Crisco in the vicinity of the crime back in 1968.
And there was a history of him working at bars as bouncers. So we thought maybe he had worked at that bar as a bouncer and she went in to have a good time.
Having identified the killer, the team turns back to unraveling the mystery of Jane Doe. They finally hear back from the lab about the victim's femur.
They were unable to get successful results from the femur. The DNA was very degraded.
And so now everybody was roundtabling, well, what else can we do? And then I think it was Jody who said, hey, why don't we just reprocess her blouse?
We were always told that with all the testing over time, all the blood off of her blouse was consumed, and it wasn't an option for DNA. But we want to know for sure.
Fortunately, the sample has been refrigerated for 33 years, and investigators submit the decades-old blouse for DNA testing.
So we were able to get a usable quantity of DNA that we could send out for SNP processing. And we received a match list of genetically connected people to our Jane Doe victim. And we started the process of building the trees.
They find the names of a handful of individuals who could be related to Jane Doe. Then, they search old newspaper obituaries from all over the country, looking for those names. What they find breaks open the case.
Constance Pateau was her name. She died in 2016. The obituary listed one of her siblings as missing since 1970, and her name was Anita. 1970 is good, but we're missing someone from 1968. But the decision was made that night to attempt to contact some of these family members to see if that was a viable lead or not.
Back in Maine, Anita's sister Ann gets a phone call from Detective Deerking.
It would have been 9:30 on the East Coast. We made a round of calls and talked with Ann. She immediately told us that Anita was missing from 1968. And at that moment, it was like, oh my gosh, this looks like it's the real deal. Our victim was Anita. It was a surreal, exciting moment for everybody connected to the case.
I was working and I kept getting a phone call from my Aunt Ann. So I answered and she was like, I got a call from a detective in Huntington Beach, California last night. They think they have Anita. And I was shocked. She's crying, I'm crying. I really never thought that I would ever know what happened to her.
And then we sent some photographs to show the person that we were trying to identify. And they said 100% million times that was their sister.
It was very overwhelming when we got the news, and we were trying to get as much information as we could as to what happened to her. It was heartbreaking to know that she was killed that way. For him to do that to her and leave her there in a ditch, that was hard.
The family also has to come to terms with the fact that Johnny Crisco will never face justice.
I wish he would have paid for what he did, but I think it was justice in the end.
He died of a tumor in his throat that blocked his airway. He slit the throat of a woman and then later died with a tumor in his throat. We felt it was a little bit of karmic justice, if you can have that in this case.
52 years after the body of Jane Doe was found in Huntington Beach, Anita's family finally holds a memorial service in her honor.
It was really heartwarming. We are really glad that she's back with us.
We had the place crying. It was just something that we never thought we'd see this day.
I elected to travel with her remains to the memorial service, and it was extremely special to not only me, but to the family, and to see the closure and to meet these people that were 3,000 miles away.
I just want everybody to remember her as this fun-loving woman. She didn't have the chance to really live her life because it was taken from her. But she was finally found and brought back to us. And that's all we really wanted. She's here.
The call arrives without ceremony. No sirens, no warning tones. Just a phone ringing in a quiet office long after the sun has set. A single vibration cutting through decades of silence. And when the receiver is lifted, the voice on the other end sounds steady in a way that feels rehearsed, as if every word has been practiced in the dark, repeated until emotion no longer slips through, until memory becomes information. And information becomes a weapon. A name is spoken. A location. A year. Florida. 1992. Cold case. Forgotten murder. The line goes dead before any questions can be asked, leaving behind a stillness so thick it feels like the air itself is waiting to see what happens next. In 1992, Florida was a place of sharp contrasts. Bright sun by day, suffocating heat by night. Neon lights buzzing over gas stations. Palm trees swaying lazily above streets where violence sometimes arrived quietly, without spectacle. On one such night, a life ended behind a closed door, unnoticed until morning light exposed what darkness had concealed. No screams reported, no neighbors calling it in, just a body discovered hours later, the room unnaturally calm, as if the scene had been arranged to look ordinary. Police responded fast. Patrol cars lined the street. Red and blue lights splashed across stucco walls and parked cars. Officers moved with urgency, but not panic. This wasn't chaos. This was confusion. The victim lay where they fell, no sign of a struggle, no obvious weapon left behind. The absence of violence felt louder than violence itself. Detectives exchanged looks that said the same thing without words. This was going to be complicated. The community gathered in small clusters, half awake, half dressed, watching from porches and sidewalks. Someone whispered the victim's name. Someone else shook their head. Everyone had a theory before sunrise. the wrong boyfriend, the quiet neighbor, a deal gone bad. Florida had seen enough crime to know how quickly stories form and how rarely they lead to truth. Inside the house, investigators documented everything. Fingerprints lifted from smooth surfaces, fibers collected and sealed, photographs taken from every angle. The process was meticulous, professional, almost hopeful. Early hours are when detectives believe answers are still close, still warm. But even then, cracks appeared. Prints that didn't match anyone in the system. No forced entry. No clear motive. The victim's life, once examined, offered no easy enemies. Friends were questioned. Co-workers interviewed. Family members brought into sterile rooms where grief collided with suspicion. Everyone answered. No one confessed. Alibis were thin but unbreakable, protected by time stamps, by people who remembered just enough to create doubt. Each interview added pages to the file without adding clarity. As days passed, Florida's heat began to work against the case. Evidence degraded. Memories shifted. What was certain on day 1 felt less solid by day 5. A neighbor changed their story slightly, not out of malice, but uncertainty. Another decided the sound they heard might have been thunder after all. The case began to lose definition, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Detectives chased leads anyway. They tracked phone records, followed rumors, knocked on doors long after residents stopped answering. A name surfaced briefly, attached to someone on the edge of the victim's life. It was noted, investigated, and dismissed when nothing concrete held it in place. In 1992, that was enough. You needed more than instinct. You needed proof that could survive court, not just suspicion that felt right. Media attention flared and faded. Headlines spoke of a mysterious killing, of fear rippling through a quiet neighborhood. Reporters asked the same questions the police couldn't answer. Who would do this? Why here? Why now? When no new information emerged, the cameras moved on. Another story took its place. Another tragedy claimed the spotlight. Weeks turned into months. The case board lost its urgency. Photos yellowed under fluorescent lights. Detectives were reassigned. New crimes demanded immediate action. The 1992 murder didn't close, but it stopped moving. Files were boxed, evidence logged and stored. The case wasn't abandoned, but it was no longer alive. It entered a long, slow sleep. For the victim's family, time did not soften anything. Every unanswered question grew heavier. They learned to measure hope carefully, because each call from police carried the risk of disappointment. Anniversaries became markers of endurance rather than remembrance. The word cold case entered their vocabulary like a diagnosis, clinical and cruel, describing a condition that offered no treatment. Years passed. The city changed. New residents moved into the house where it happened, unaware of the history beneath fresh paint and new furniture. Children played on the same sidewalks where officers once stood taking notes. The murder became a footnote, a story older neighbors referenced when warning newcomers that things weren't always as safe as they seemed. Inside the evidence room, the case waited. Boxes stacked among hundreds of others, each containing fragments of lives interrupted. Technology advanced outside those walls. DNA databases expanded. Fingerprint analysis grew sharper. But unless someone asked the right question, the right box remained sealed. Then, decades later, the anonymous tip arrives. It doesn't confess. It doesn't beg. It doesn't explain motives or emotions. It simply points back to that old name, the one briefly considered and discarded. This time, the name doesn't disappear in a paperwork. This time, it lands in a different world. Detectives pull the file with caution, aware of what reopening a cold case means. Expectations are low by design. Hope is dangerous, but procedure demands review. The first step is always the same. Start over. Assume nothing. Trust nothing. Question everything. They read reports written by hands long retired. They listened to recordings captured on outdated equipment, voices crackling through static. They noticed pauses where answers came too quickly. They see decisions shaped by the limitations of the time. No one made obvious mistakes, but no one had the tools available now. The anonymous tip becomes a focal point, not because of its content, but because of its timing. Someone waited decades to speak. That decision carries weight. It suggests fear, or guilt, or knowledge that only ripened with time. The detectives begin connecting dots slowly, deliberately. They cross-reference the name with modern databases. Addresses appear, employment histories, associations, a life lived quietly, invisibly, while the case slept. The idea that someone could walk free for decades, believing themselves safe, settles heavily in a room. When they call the victim's family, they choose their words carefully. There is no promise of resolution, only movement. The case is active again. New information is being reviewed. Silence follows on the line, the kind of silence built from years of restraint. Then a breath. Then a single question that has waited since 1992. Is it real this time? Outside the precinct, life continues unaware. Traffic flows. Restaurants close. Night settles over Florida the same way it always has, humid and indifferent. But inside those walls, the past has been disturbed. A file reopened. A name reconsidered. A truth long buried, shifting restlessly beneath the surface. The cold case is no longer sleeping. It is listening. Morning doesn't bring clarity. It brings paperwork, coffee gone cold, and the slow realization that reopening a case means reopening everything that was sealed with it, every assumption, every quiet compromise made in the name of moving on. The file sits open on the table like a wound that never healed properly, edges frayed, pages warped by humidity and time. And as the detectives lean in, they feel the weight of 3 decades pressing down on every line of ink. The first rule is discipline. No shortcuts. No romantic notions about justice waiting patiently to be found. Cold cases punish optimism. They reward method. So they start where it all began, with the victim, not the suspect, not the tip, but the life that ended in 1992, because motive doesn't exist in a vacuum. It grows in the shadow of routine, in habits repeated until someone notices them too closely. The victim's schedule is reconstructed hour by hour. Work logs, phone records, handwritten notes pulled from old evidence bags. A grocery receipt creased and yellowed, but still legible. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous. A life that looked ordinary from the outside, which only deepens the unease. Ordinary lives don't usually end this way, quietly, without explanation. Interviews from the time are replayed. Voices from the past echo through speakers not designed for nostalgia. Friends sound nervous. Co-workers sound confused. Everyone insists they noticed nothing strange, which is always the most suspicious answer. Not because it's false, but because it's incomplete. People rarely notice danger until it's already passed. One interview stands out now in a way it didn't before. A short exchange, barely 2 minutes long, dismissed at the time as unhelpful. A person who knew the victim casually, not close enough to grieve publicly, not distant enough to be irrelevant. Their answers were concise, too concise. At the time, efficiency was mistaken for cooperation. Now it reads like restraint. The name from the anonymous tip appears again, not boldly, but consistently, like a watermark visible only when the page is tilted just right. They trace it through the file. A mention here, a reference there, always adjacent, never central. A person who orbited the victim's life without leaving fingerprints strong enough to accuse. In 1992, that was enough to move on. Today, it's enough to pause. Detectives pull contemporary records. Databases hum quietly as decades of data align. Addresses change. Jobs shift. Relationships begin and end. The name persists through it all, untouched by scandal, untouched by arrest records, living a life clean enough to avoid notice. That kind of cleanliness raises questions of its own. They check alibis from the night of the murder, preserved in notes that read like shorthand prayers. At the time, the alibi held because someone vouched for it. That someone is now dead. The verification died with them. What remains is a claim unsupported by anything solid enough to survive scrutiny. Time has a way of eroding foundations that once felt permanent. The detectives visit the old neighborhood, not because they expect it to look the same, but because physical space holds memory differently. Streets remember footsteps even when people forget them. The house stands renovated, modern, indifferent. New owners answer the door politely, unaware they're standing in a place once frozen by flashing lights and whispered fear. They don't ask to enter. They don't need to. The scene exists now in photographs and measurements, in mental reconstructions layered over fresh paint. They stand on the sidewalk and imagine the night unfolding, the moment when something ordinary turned irrevocable. Neighbors from that era are harder to find. Some moved away, some passed on. A few remain, older now, slower, their memories softened by time, but sharpened by distance. One recalls the night differently now, not with certainty, but with a feeling. A car idling longer than necessary, a shadow that didn't belong. These are not facts. They are impressions, dangerous, but not useless. Back at the precinct, the evidence room opens its metal mouth reluctantly. Boxes are pulled, gloves snapped on, inventory checked against logs written by people who assumed no one would ever read them again. Every item is handled like it might finally have something to say. There are fingerprints, partial, smudged, inconclusive by the standards of the early 90s. There are fibers that couldn't be matched then, cataloged, and forgotten. There is a single item that draws prolonged attention, not because it's dramatic, but because it's mundane, something that shouldn't have been there at all. In 1992, it was noted and dismissed as contamination. Now, with modern analysis, dismissal feels premature. The anonymous tip hangs over every decision like a question mark. Who made the call? Why now? Was it guilt finally outweighing fear, or resentment aging into revenge? Motive matters less than credibility, and credibility is built slowly, through verification, through consistency, through the absence of contradiction. They check phone records tied to the tip. Disposable, untraceable. The caller knew enough to protect themselves. That suggests intent. That suggests forethought. This wasn't an impulse. It was a decision delayed for decades. Prosecutors are briefed cautiously. No declarations. No press releases. Just information, raw and incomplete. They've seen cases like this implode under the weight of expectation. They advise patience. Build quietly. Let the facts speak before anyone else does. Meanwhile, the family waits again. Waiting is a skill they mastered unwillingly. Each day, without news, stretches thin, pulled taut between hope and dread. They don't tell friends. They don't celebrate. They sit with the knowledge that something is happening, and that is both comforting and terrifying. The suspect, unaware or pretending to be, continues life uninterrupted, goes to work, buys groceries, exchanges pleasantries. The idea that someone can live normally while a storm gathers silently around them is one of the most unsettling truths of criminal investigation. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in perfectly. Detectives begin discreet surveillance, not to arrest, but to observe. Patterns emerge. Habits unchanged by time. A fondness for routine. Predictability mistaken for safety. They note it all, writing reports that read like biographies stripped of empathy. Old associates are quietly contacted. Conversations are casual, framed as background checks. Some people talk too much. Others say nothing. One person hesitates when the name is mentioned, a fraction of a second longer than expected. That hesitation is logged, not as evidence, as texture. The cold case unit meets late into the night. Whiteboards fill with timelines reimagined. Red strings connect events that were once isolated. The room hums with restrained intensity. No one raises their voice. No one celebrates connections. They've learned that excitement clouds judgment. They send evidence for reanalysis. Modern labs, modern tools. Results won't come quickly. Science is patient, but not hurried. In the meantime, they prepare for the possibility that the anonymous tip leads nowhere. That is always a possibility. Cold cases teach humility first and foremost. Still, something feels different. Not optimism. Alignment. Pieces that once resisted each other now sit closer together. Not locked, but compatible. The detectives sense it in the way conversations flow, in the way questions lead to more questions rather than dead ends. Outside, Florida continues its routine indifference. Sunday rain, traffic. The world has no obligation to pause for justice. Inside the precinct, however, time feels compressed, decades collapsing into days as the past demands attention it was denied. Late one evening, a preliminary lab report arrives. It doesn't confirm anything. It doesn't accuse anyone. It simply states that something once thought unusable is now viable, that the door is open wider than it has ever been. The detectives read the report in silence. No one smiles. No one speaks. They understand what this means. If they step through that door, there is no turning back. Lives will be disrupted, reputations questioned, pain revived. They choose to proceed. Because cold cases don't reopen themselves. Someone has to decide that the cost of truth is worth paying, even decades later, even when the past has learned how to hide. And somewhere, whether they know it yet or not, the person who believed they had outrun time begins to feel a subtle shift in the air, a pressure they can't explain, the faint but unmistakable sensation that the ground beneath them is no longer as solid as it once was. The first crack appears quietly, not with sirens or shouted orders, but with a phone call that comes in after midnight, when the building is mostly dark and the kind of people still awake are the kind who expect bad news. The lab supervisor doesn't dramatize it. They never do. Their voice is flat, precise, almost bored, as if discussing weather patterns instead of the past clawing its way back into the present. The sample is usable. Not perfect, not cinematic, but usable in a way that did not exist in 1992, usable in a way that turns speculation into direction. The detectives don't celebrate. They don't high-five. They sit in silence, absorbing the meaning of a single word that carries 30 years of weight. Usable means comparison. Usable means databases. Usable means that a forgotten fragment, once dismissed as noise, might finally speak in a language the system understands. Morning arrives with urgency disguised as routine. Requests are filed. Warrants drafted carefully, conservatively, built on restraint rather than ambition. The name from the anonymous tip is now circled in ink, not red yet, but darker than the rest. DNA is a delicate bridge. Cross it too early and it collapses. Cross it too late and the trail goes cold again. They begin with what the law allows easily. Discarded items. Public spaces. No confrontation. No alerting instincts honed by guilt. Surveillance teams rotate quietly, noting habits with the patience of predators who understand that speed is not strength. A coffee cup tossed in a trash can. A napkin left on a counter. Small things. Intimate things. Pieces of a person collected without their awareness. The waiting returns, heavier now. Evidence moves through systems that don't care about narrative or justice, only protocols and cues. Days stretch. Each hour feels borrowed. The detectives replay interviews in their heads, reassessing tone, posture, pauses that once meant nothing. In hindsight, everything wants to become a clue. They resist that urge. Cold cases punish imagination unchecked. When the results arrive, they don't arrive alone. They come with numbers, probabilities, language designed to withstand cross-examination. The match is not absolute. It never is. But it is strong enough to demand attention, strong enough to turn a person of interest into something more dangerous, more fragile. The room tightens. Chairs scrape. Someone exhales sharply, not in triumph, but in recognition. This is the moment cases pivot, when the abstract becomes personal, when the question stops being what happened and starts becoming who did it. Prosecutors are called again, this time with more confidence, but still no bravado. They ask the hard questions immediately. Chain of custody, contamination, alternative explanations. The detectives answer without embellishment. They know skepticism is not opposition, it's armor. The decision is made to move closer, not to arrest, but to pressure the edges, to see what happens when the past stops staying buried. An interview is scheduled under the pretense of clearing up old records. The suspect agrees too quickly. That, too, is noted. The interview room hasn't changed much since the 90s. Same muted colors. Same one-way glass. Same illusion of control. The suspect sits calmly, posture relaxed, hands folded. They look older, of course. Everyone does. Age has softened the face, but sharpened the eyes, the kind of eyes that track movement without seeming to. The detectives begin gently, voices neutral, questions framed as administrative. The suspect answers smoothly, rehearsed narratives sliding into place with practiced ease. They speak of the victim with appropriate sadness, appropriate distance. Nothing incriminating, nothing false enough to challenge outright. Then the detectives shift subtly. Dates are adjusted, times nudged, details introduced that weren't in the original file. They watch closely. Most people correct mistakes reflexively. This suspect hesitates, recalibrates, then answers. A fraction too slow. A fraction too careful. The temperature in the room changes. Not visibly. Internally. The detectives feel it. The suspect feels it. Something unspoken has entered the space. An awareness that this is no longer a courtesy call. They don't mention DNA. Not yet. They don't need to. Pressure is more effective when it's implied rather than declared. Instead, they talk about the anonymous tip. Not accusingly. Casually. As if discussing whether. The suspect's jaw tightens. Just enough. After the interview, nothing happens immediately. No arrest. No dramatic exit. The suspect leaves, expression controlled, but their routine fractures. Surveillance notes changes. Routes altered. Trash disposed of more carefully. Phones silenced at odd hours. Guilt doesn't always confess itself. Sometimes it reorganizes. The detectives expand their net. Financial records. Old disputes. A forgotten argument unearthed from a coworker's memory. Something said in anger, dismissed at the time as venting. Now it sounds different. Now it sounds like motive learning to speak. The victim's life is re-examined through a sharper lens. Relationships, once considered peripheral, move closer to the center. A connection emerges, faint but undeniable, between victim and suspect that was never fully explored. In 1992, it seemed insignificant. In hindsight, it looks deliberate. Community whispers begin, not publicly, but in private spaces where secrets feel safer. Someone remembers a night when the suspect came home late, agitated. Someone else recalls a scratch that was explained away too quickly. These are not proofs. They are threads. Enough threads, however, begin to form a rope. The family is updated carefully. Not with details, not with promises. Just enough to prepare them for what may come. Their reactions are restrained, learned over years of disappointment. Hope is dangerous. They hold it gingerly like glass. The cold case unit feels the shift too. The case no longer feels like history. It feels present, alive, demanding attention with every passing hour. The detectives sleep less, eat standing up, live in the margins of their own lives because someone else's ended before it should have. Another lab result arrives. This one tighter, more confident, statistical language that leaves less room for coincidence. The prosecutors stop leaning back in their chairs. They lean forward now. Conversations change tone. Strategy replaces speculation. A decision point looms. Arrest now, on what they have, or push further, risk exposure but strengthen the case. The debate is quiet but intense. Move too soon, and the case could fracture under defense scrutiny. Wait too long, and the suspect might run, destroy evidence, or worse. They choose patience again, controlled pressure. Another interview is scheduled, this time less friendly. The suspect arrives guarded. The detectives present contradictions, gently at first, then with increasing firmness. Alibis crumble under scrutiny, not dramatically, but audibly like ice cracking beneath weight. Then the DNA is mentioned, not all of it, just enough. The suspect's composure slips, not into panic, but into calculation. They ask for a lawyer. The room freezes. The interview ends. Outside, rain begins to fall, sudden and heavy, washing streets that have seen too much. The detectives stand under the overhang, listening to it, knowing they've crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Paperwork accelerates. Warrants are drafted with meticulous care. Judges are briefed. Every I dotted. Every T crossed. The system moves slowly, but now it moves with purpose. The suspect goes home that night, knowing something is wrong. They feel it in the way silence stretches, in the way familiar spaces feel suddenly exposed. They don't know what the detectives know, but they know enough to fear what comes next. The cold case, dormant for decades, is no longer sleeping. It is awake, alert, and closing distance, and the gap between past and present shrinks with every measured step, every quiet decision, every truth that refuses to stay buried any longer. The arrest does not come with flashing lights or a shouted name through a megaphone. It comes before dawn, in that fragile hour when the night hasn't fully let go and the day hasn't yet claimed the streets. A knock, firm and deliberate, cuts through the quiet of a Florida suburb where lawns are trimmed and neighbors wave politely without ever really knowing one another. Inside the house, a light clicks on. Somewhere, a clock keeps ticking. Unaware, it is marking the final seconds of a life lived in denial. The door opens slowly. The suspect blinks against the porch light. Confusion carefully arranged on their face. Confusion that does not quite reach the eyes. The detectives identify themselves. Voices calm, almost respectful. Hands are shown. Instructions are given. There is no resistance, no shouting. Only a brief pause when the words "under arrest" land with the dull weight of inevitability. For a moment, the suspect's shoulders sag, just slightly, as if something they have been holding up for decades has finally been allowed to fall. Neighbors watch through blinds, silhouettes frozen in curiosity and disbelief. This is not how monsters are supposed to look. This is someone they've seen at barbecues, someone who returned library books on time, someone who aged normally while a family across town aged in grief. At the station, the booking process unfolds with bureaucratic precision. Fingerprints taken again, now with purpose. Photographs snapped under harsh lighting that shows every line, every year that has passed since 1992. The detectives observe from behind glass, not with satisfaction, but with a sober understanding that an arrest is not an ending. It is an opening. The real battle begins here. Interrogation is requested, then declined. The lawyer arrives quickly, efficient, professional, already framing the story in their head. The suspect says nothing now. Silence becomes their final strategy. But silence cannot erase what has already been said in motion. Evidence is stacked, categorized, rehearsed. The DNA results sit at the center, cold and clinical, numbers that speak louder than any witness ever could. The defense immediately challenges them, pointing to age, degradation, possibility of contamination. The prosecution responds with protocols, expert testimony, the meticulous care taken at every step. This is not television. There are no dramatic gasps, only a slow tightening of logic around a man who believed time itself was his alibi. As news breaks, the community fractures into whispers and headlines. Florida 1992 cold case solved. The words feel surreal, like history being rewritten in real time. Reporters dig through archives, replaying footage of candlelight vigils held decades ago. The victim's name is spoken again, no longer just as a memory, but as a central figure in a living story. The family learns of the arrest in a quiet room, seated together, hands clasped, bracing for disappointment even now. When the confirmation comes, it doesn't explode into joy. It settles. Tears fall, not from relief alone, but from the sudden realization that the waiting, the endless waiting, has finally changed shape. The question is no longer, will we ever know, but can we survive knowing? Court proceedings begin slowly, deliberately. Motions filed, hearings scheduled, every step measured against the risk of collapse. The defense paints the suspect as a victim of circumstance, a convenient target for a desperate cold case unit eager for closure. They point to faded memories, unreliable witnesses, the dangers of retrospective justice. The prosecution counters with a timeline rebuilt piece by piece, showing opportunity, motive, connection. They resurrect details buried in old files, details that once seemed trivial, but now align with chilling clarity. A phone call made and then denied. A scratch explained as an accident. A lie told so smoothly it was accepted without question. The jury selection process reveals the true weight of the case. Potential jurors admit to fear, to doubt, to an unease about judging something that happened before smartphones, before DNA kits were household words. Some are dismissed for bias. Others remain, faces solemn, understanding that they are being asked to bridge decades with reason and empathy. During testimony, the detectives take the stand, voices steady as they recount the long arc of the investigation. They speak not as heroes, but as custodians of facts. They describe the anonymous tip, careful not to romanticize it. They explain the science, the waiting, the restraint. The courtroom listens, quiet, absorbing the idea that patience, not luck, cracked the case. Expert witnesses follow, translating genetic probabilities into plain language. They explain how science evolved, how what was impossible in 1992 became routine decades later. The defense cross-examines aggressively, but the foundation holds. This is not a miracle. This is math. Then come the witnesses from the community. People older now, voices trembling as they recall nights that never made sense until now. A coworker describes an argument they once dismissed. A neighbor remembers seeing a car at an unusual hour. Each testimony is a thread, and together they weave a narrative the defense struggles to unravel. The suspect finally takes the stand, against counsel's advice. Perhaps pride, perhaps desperation. They deny everything, voice calm, eyes scanning the jury for sympathy. They speak of a life lived honestly, of being haunted by the accusation itself. But something is off. The words are polished, rehearsed, lacking the rawness of truth. The prosecutor waits, then introduces a contradiction so small, almost seems unfair. The suspect stumbles. Just once. It is enough. Closing arguments arrive without theatrics. The prosecution speaks of time not as an eraser, but as a witness. They remind the jury that the victim never had the chance to grow old, to sit in a courtroom decades later and tell their story. The defense warns against certainty, against the seductive pull of closure. They urge doubt. The jury deliberates longer than anyone expects. Hours stretch into days. The family waits in silence. The suspect waits in a cell, stripped now of routine, left alone with memories that have no place to hide. When a verdict is read, it is delivered plainly. Guilty. The word echoes, not loudly, but deeply. The family exhales as one, a sound that carries decades of pain. The suspect shows little reaction, but something flickers in their eyes. Not shock, but recognition. The past is finally caught up. Sentencing follows weeks later. Statements are read. The family speaks, voices breaking as they address a man who once moved freely through their lives without consequence. They do not shout. They do not curse. They speak of absence, of birthdays missed, of future that never arrived. The judge delivers the sentence with gravity, acknowledging both the crime and the years that passed before accountability arrived. It is not vengeance. It is acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, cameras flash. Headlines write themselves. But inside, in the quiet spaces left behind, the truth settles unevenly. Justice has been served, they say, but justice, in cold cases, is never clean. It comes late. It comes scarred. The detectives return to their office, the file finally closed, stamped, and shelved. They know another waits. Always another. They sit for a moment longer, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, understanding that while one ghost has been laid to rest, the echoes will linger in the family, in the community, and in the quiet certainty that time does not forgive, it only delays. And somewhere in Florida, a house stands empty, a lawn untrimmed, a door that will never open the same way again, marking the final footprint of a secret that thought it could outlive the truth. The sentence does not end the story. It changes its temperature. What once burned with uncertainty now cools into something heavier, something that sinks rather than flares. The courtroom empties slowly, footsteps echoing across polished floors. Conversations reduced to murmurs, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile shape of what has just been decided. Outside, Florida's sunlight floods the steps, indifferent, relentless, shining on reporters who raise microphones and cameras as if they can extract meaning from a verdict with the right question. Inside a quiet hallway, the family pauses. For decades, they imagined this moment as a finish line. Instead, it feels like a door opening onto a room they have never entered before. There is relief, yes, but it is tangled with grief sharpened by clarity. Knowing who did it does not bring back the voice they lost, the life that stopped in 1992. It only rearranges the pain, gives it a name and a face. Detectives give brief statements, careful, restrained. They speak of perseverance, of advances in forensic science, of the importance of never giving up. But when the microphones lower and the lights dim, their shoulders drop. The adrenaline drains. What remains is exhaustion and a quiet reckoning with the cost of carrying a dead person's story for so long. Back at the precinct, the cold case unit gathers around the evidence table one last time. Boxes are open again, not for investigation now, but for closure. Each item is handled with something close to reverence. The preserved clothing, the faded photographs, the handwritten notes from officers long retired or long dead. This evidence outlived careers. It outlived marriages. It outlived certainty. One detective traces a finger along the edge of a file folder, remembering the first time they read it. They remember thinking the case felt wrong, incomplete, like a sentence without punctuation. Now, the punctuation has arrived, but it does not feel triumphant. It feels final. They wonder how many nights the victims spent afraid, how many seconds passed between realization and impact. Those questions never made it into the case file. They never will. The anonymous tipster remains anonymous. Their voice, distorted by technology and intention, is never heard publicly. They vanish back into the fabric of the city, leaving behind only the consequence of their choice. The detectives debate, briefly, whether the tip came from guilt or courage. They agree it does not matter. The truth does not care why it was revealed, only that it was. In the weeks that follow, the story spreads beyond Florida. True crime podcasts dissect the case with forensic enthusiasm. Timelines are redrawn, suspects reimagined, mistakes highlighted. Some praise law enforcement. Others question why it took so long. Comment sections fill with arguments between strangers who speak as if they were there, as if hindsight is a form of participation. The family does not listen. They turn inward, learning how to exist without the tension that once defined their days. There is no more waiting for the phone to ring. No more wondering if today will be the day. That absence feels almost frightening. They must relearn who they are without hope as a daily companion. At night, memories surface uninvited, not of the crime, but of ordinary moments now sharpened by nostalgia. A laugh, a shared meal, a promise never kept because it never had the chance to be broken. Justice does not erase these memories. It frames them. The convicted man is transferred to a correctional facility far from the neighborhood where he once blended in seamlessly. His routine becomes rigid, predictable, stripped of autonomy. In interviews requested and denied, he maintains his innocence. In private moments, there is no record of what he thinks. The system does not require remorse. It requires compliance. Other inmates learn his name, his crime, the year attached to it. Cold case. The phrase follows him like a shadow, a reminder that time did not protect him. Some see him as unlucky, others as arrogant for believing he was safe. None see him as the person he once pretended to be. The detectives move on. Another box is pulled from the shelf. Another family waits somewhere, unaware that their story is about to be reopened. The lessons from a 1992 case linger. Preserve everything. Document obsessively. Assume the future will be smarter than the present. They work differently now because of it. In training rooms, the case becomes a lesson. Recruits listen as instructors explain how evidence once dismissed became decisive decades later. They emphasize patience, humility, restraint. They warn against tunnel vision. They remind them that today's overlooked detail may be tomorrow's breakthrough. The city absorbs the verdict unevenly. Some residents feel safer, believing a hidden threat has been removed. Others feel uneasy, realizing how easily violence once lived among them unnoticed. The streets look the same. The stores open and close on schedule. But there is an undercurrent now, a shared awareness that time does not cleanse, it preserves. Anniversaries arrive differently after the verdict. The date once marked by questions is now marked by reflection. Flowers are placed, candles lit, names spoken aloud without fear of being forgotten. The family gathers, not to demand answers, but to remember a life that existed beyond its ending. Yet the case is never fully gone. It resurfaces in legal journals, in discussions about the ethics of late justice, about the psychological toll of delayed accountability. Experts debate whether closure is a myth. The family listens sometimes, nodding at points, disagreeing at others. Closure, they decide, is not a door that closes. It is a window that opens just enough to let air in. In quieter moments, one family member wonders what would have happened if the tip had never come, if the DNA had remained untested, if the file had stayed sealed. They imagine the suspect dying peacefully, never named. The thought is unbearable. They remind themselves that the truth arrived, however late, because someone refused to let the past stay buried. The evidence locker is reorganized. Space is made, but one shelf remains marked with a small plaque, unofficial, placed there by someone who knew the weight of the case. It bears only a year and a name. No explanation. Those who know. Late one evening, long after the news cycle has moved on, a detective drives past the old crime scene. The building has been renovated. New paint, new occupants. No sign of what happened there in 1992. They park for a moment, engine idling, and imagine the night as it was. The sounds, the fear, the suddenness. Then they drive away, leaving the past where it belongs, not forgotten, but acknowledged. The cold case is solved, the headlines say. But solved does not mean simple. It does not mean healed. It means named. It means faced. It means that a secret carried through decades has finally been forced into the light, where it looks smaller, uglier, and less powerful than it once did. And as the city sleeps, unaware of how many stories still wait in boxes and lockers, the echo of 1992 lingers softly, a reminder that time may delay the truth, but it does not erase it, and that even the coldest cases can still burn when touched by memory. The case may be stamped closed, but the city does not sleep any easier. Night still settles heavy over Florida streets, humid and thick, pressing down on houses that look calm from the outside and restless within. The solved cold case becomes a whisper that travels after dark, passed between neighbors on porches, between bartenders wiping counters, between patrol officers idling at red lights. It is no longer a question of who did it. It is the deeper, more unsettling realization of how long it took. For the detectives, the days after the verdict blur together. Paperwork replaces adrenaline. Reports are finalized, databases updated, evidence logged for long-term storage. The work is mechanical, but the mind is not. Every signature carries the weight of finality. Every checkbox feels like a small betrayal of the chaos that once defined the case. This file lived. It breathed. Now it is reduced to forms and codes. One investigator rereads the original 1992 incident report late at night, alone in the office. The language is sparse, factual, almost cold. No adjectives, no speculation, just timestamps and observations. They wonder what the young officer who wrote it felt that night. Fear? Confidence? Exhaustion? That officer never knew the report would survive 3 decades. Never knew it would become a bridge between generations of law enforcement. The evidence that cracked the case, once overlooked, once dormant, now feels almost accusatory. It sat silently while lives unfolded, while suspects aged, while the victim's family grieved birthdays and holidays with an empty chair. Science did not fail them in 1992. Time did. or rather, patients with time did. In the community, reactions fracture along invisible lines. Some celebrate justice loudly, posting headlines and triumphant captions online. Others recoil from the spectacle, uncomfortable with the idea that closure has been turned into content. The victim's name trends briefly, then fades beneath the next breaking story. Attention, like justice, arrives late and leaves early. The family watches from a distance. They have learned caution. Public sympathy is unpredictable. It can lift you one day and abandon you the next. They accept condolences quietly, grateful but guarded. The pain is no longer raw, but it is deep, settled, permanent. Solving the case did not erase it. It clarified it. At night, one family member dreams of the past as if it were happening in real time. Not the violence, but the hours before. A normal day, a normal conversation. In the dream, there's a sense of urgency, a feeling that something must be said before it is too late. They wake with their heart racing, reminded that time only moves in one direction, no matter how badly you want to warn yourself. The convicted man begins his life measured in routines and rules. Prison time stretches differently. Days feel endless. Years collapse into repetition. He appeals as expected. His legal team argues procedural errors, chain of custody issues, the reliability of decades-old evidence. The court listens, impassive. The system allows hope, even for the guilty. Hope, after all, is not evidence. Other inmates tell stories of crimes half remembered, half exaggerated. Cold cases circulate like legends. Tales of men who thought they were safe. Of secrets buried deep until technology dug them up. The message is clear, even if no one says it out loud. Time is not protection. Back in the cold case unit, the solved file changes the atmosphere. Morale lifts, but pressure increases. Families call more often now. They have seen what is possible. They want the same miracle. Detectives temper expectations carefully, knowing that not every case carries DNA. Not every mystery has a forgotten tip waiting to surface. Training seminars reference the case repeatedly. Slides show grainy photographs, diagrams of evidence storage, timelines stretching across decades. Instructors emphasize discipline. Preserve everything, they say, even what seems useless. The recruits nod, scribbling notes, unaware of how heavy those words will feel when they stand in their first crime scene. Journalists revisit the story from new angles. Some focus on the science, others on the human cost of delay. A few dig into the convicted man's past, searching for signs that were missed. Neighbors are interviewed, old classmates, coworkers. Everyone says the same thing. He seemed normal. Normal, it turns out, is not an alibi. The neighborhood where the crime occurred feels different now, subtly altered by knowledge. People lock their doors a little earlier. They glance at familiar faces with new curiosity. Trust, once shaken, does not fully reset. It recalibrates. A memorial service is held quietly, intentionally small. No cameras, no speeches meant for public consumption. Just family, close friends, and a few detectives who earned the right to be there through years of persistence. The victim's name is spoken, not as a headline, but as a person. Stories are shared that never made it into police reports. Laughter breaks through tears, unexpected and welcome. One detective stands at the edge of the gathering, uncomfortable but present. They realize this is the real end of the case, not the verdict, not the press conference. This moment, where the story returns to the people it was taken from. They feel both honored and intrusive, a witness to grief that no badge can justify. In private, the detectives confront their own ghosts. Every solved case casts shadows over the unsolved ones. Faces blur together in memory. Names resurface unexpectedly. They wonder how many answers sit just beyond reach, waiting for the right technology, the right voice, the right moment of courage. The anonymous tip remains a mystery. Investigators debate whether to keep searching for its source. Eventually, they let it go. The tip did its job. Forcing it into the light might only silence others in the future. Sometimes anonymity is the price of truth. Months pass. The appeals process grinds forward slowly, predictably. Life resumes its routines. Yet the case lingers in subtle ways. A detective hears a song on the radio that was popular in 1992 and feels an unexpected tightening in their chest. A family member catches a glimpse of someone who looks like the victim at a grocery store and has to step outside to breathe. The solved cold case becomes part of the city's identity, a reference point in conversations about crime and justice. Remember the 1992 case? People say, they finally solved it. Finally. The word carries both satisfaction and accusation. Late one night, a young officer on patrol pulls into the precinct parking lot and looks up at the building. They think about the cases stored inside, the boxes and shelves full of unanswered questions. The Florida air is still heavy with possibility. They feel a quiet determination settle in. Time may be slow, but it is not infinite. Someone has to keep asking. The cold case taught the city a lesson it will never fully forget, that the past is not passive. It waits. It watches. And when the conditions are right, when a voice breaks its silence, when science catches up, when persistence outlasts denial, it speaks with a clarity that no amount of time can soften. And so the story continues, not as a mystery anymore, but as a reminder, echoing through courtrooms, evidence lockers, and sleepless nights, that justice delayed is still justice demanded, and that even after decades, the truth can still arrive like a knock at the door, sharp, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Time moves forward, but the solved cold case refuses to stay buried in the past. It settles into the city like a low, constant hum, barely audible yet impossible to silence. Every siren that cuts through the Florida night seems sharper now. Every flashing light a reminder that the distance between yesterday and today is thinner than anyone wants to believe. Inside the courthouse, the appeal hearings begin without drama. No crowds, no cameras, just wood-paneled rooms, restrained voices, and legal language stripped of emotion. The defense argues deterioration of evidence, contamination, the unfairness of judging a man for actions allegedly committed when Ronald Reagan was still in office. Prosecutors respond with precision, pointing to chains of custody, lab certifications, and the unbroken thread of proof that survived decades of neglect and storage. The judge listens, expression unreadable. Justice here is not cinematic. It is procedural. It unfolds line by line, precedent by precedent. Outside, the sun rises and sets without regard for arguments made inside. Families go to work. Children come home from school. Life continues, indifferent to the fact that history is being relitigated behind closed doors. For the victim's family, the appeal is a reopening of wounds they thought had finally begun to scar. Each hearing date circles on the calendar like a threat. They attend when they can, sitting quietly, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. The defendant does not look at them. Or maybe he does, briefly, when no one is watching. They cannot tell. They stop trying. At night, questions creep back in. What if the conviction is overturned? What if the evidence, once triumphant, becomes fragile under scrutiny? They remind themselves that truth does not change, even when verdicts do. But reassurance is fragile in the dark. In the police department, the solved case changes how cold cases are discussed. There's less resignation now, less shrugging acceptance of failure. Younger detectives push harder. They ask uncomfortable questions. Why was this evidence overlooked? Why was this witness dismissed? Why did it take an anonymous tip to break institutional inertia? Veteran investigators bristle at first. No one likes their past decisions interrogated. But slowly, defensiveness gives way to reflection. The truth is unavoidable. Resources were limited, biases existed, priorities shifted. The system did not fail out of malice. It failed out of human limitation. Training manuals are revised. Evidence retention policies tightened. Digital tracking replaces handwritten logs. The solved 1992 cold case becomes a cautionary tale woven into policy language. A reminder that mistakes made quietly can echo loudly decades later. Meanwhile, the city's media ecosystem continues to feed on the story in waves. Podcasts dissect timelines minute by minute. True crime channels speculate about alternate suspects, secondary motives, conspiracy theories that ignore the verdict entirely. The internet does not crave closure. It craves engagement. The family avoids most of it. They have learned that public curiosity is not the same as empathy. Still, fragments slip through. A headline, a clip, a comment section arguing about guilt like it is a sports score. Each exposure feels invasive, a reminder that their private loss has become public property. The convicted man's relatives face their own quiet reckoning. Some cut ties completely, unable to reconcile memory with reality. Others cling to denial, insisting on innocence despite evidence that feels overwhelming to everyone else. Family loyalty collides with truth, and neither side emerges unscathed. In prison, the man adapts to routine. Appeals give him something to hold on to, a structure of hope measured in filing deadlines and court dates. He tells himself stories that soften the edges of memory. Stories where responsibility is shared, where circumstances mattered more than choices, where time itself becomes an accomplice. Other inmates listen without judgment. Everyone inside has a version of their past they prefer to live in. Cold case convictions carry a particular weight, a reminder that freedom can be revoked long after you think you've escaped consequences. Back on the street where the crime happened, subtle changes accumulate. A house repainted, a fence replaced. New residents move in, unaware of the history at first. Someone eventually tells them. Someone always does. The newcomers listen, uneasy, glancing at the ground, at the trees, at the shadows cast by streetlights that haven't changed since 1992. They ask the same question everyone asks. How could something like that happen here? No one has a satisfying answer. A retired detective who worked the original investigation watches the appeal coverage from his living room. He hasn't spoken publicly. He doubts he ever will. The case feels like a mirror held up too late. He remembers long nights, stacks of files, the pressure to clear cases quickly. He remembers thinking this one would solve itself eventually. It didn't. He turns off the television and sits in silence, aware that the past cannot be corrected, only acknowledged. The anonymous tipster remains unknown, but their impact grows with time. Other cold case units across the state report an uptick in tips, people emboldened by proof that their voices can matter even decades later. Some tips go nowhere. Some reopen doors long thought sealed shut. Detectives learn to listen differently, to hear not just what is said, but why it is said now. Timing becomes its own kind of evidence. For the victim's family, small rituals take on new meaning. A birthday remembered, a favorite song played, a quiet visit to a place that once felt ordinary and now feels sacred. They're no longer waiting for answers, but they are learning how to live with them. One family member volunteers with a victim's advocacy group, speaking softly to others navigating unresolved grief. They don't promise closure. They promise persistence. The idea that waiting does not mean forgetting, and that silence does not mean absence. As months stretch into a year, the appeal is denied. The ruling is concise, unemotional. The evidence stands. The conviction remains. There is no celebration, no release of tension like in movies. Just a muted exhale. Justice, it turns out, is not a single moment. It is a process that settles slowly, unevenly, into the lives it touches. The cold case file is archived again, this time with finality. A red stamp replaces a question mark. Solved. The word feels both satisfying and insufficient. In the precinct, new cases demand attention. New victims. New mysteries. But the shadow of the old case lingers, shaping instincts, sharpening awareness. No one assumes time will take care of anything on its own anymore. Late one evening, detective locks up the evidence room and pauses, hand on the door. Inside, thousands of stories wait in boxes and bags, some loud, some silent, all unfinished until proven otherwise. The Florida night hums outside, heavy with heat and possibility. The lesson of the 1992 cold case is not just that justice can arrive late. It is that it only arrives when someone refuses to stop looking. And somewhere in the city, beneath layers of memory and routine, the past remains alert, patient, ready to surface again the moment it is called by name. The story should have ended there, stamped and filed, but cold cases never truly conclude. They settle, they linger, they breathe quietly beneath the surface of everyday life, waiting for the moment someone stumbles over their shadow again. In Florida, the heat keeps secrets alive. It preserves them in the air, in the soil, in the way the city never fully cools down, even after midnight. Years pass after the appeal is denied, and the conviction hardens into fact. Court records close. Headlines fade. The name of the victim appears less often in print, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher crimes. But for those who lived through it, time does not erase, it rearranges. The neighborhood changes in subtle, unsettling ways. New families arrive with rental trucks and optimism, unaware at first of what once happened on their street. Children ride bikes past the house where the murder unfolded, laughing, shouting, their voices colliding with echoes no one else can hear. Parents watch from porches, instinctively uneasy, unable to explain why. Someone eventually mentions it. They always do. A neighbor, a local bartender, a casual conversation that stiffens mid-sentence. The words cold case still carry weight, even solved. Especially solved. It confirms that the danger was once real, that it lived here. Inside the police department, the case becomes legend, not because of its brutality, but because of its delay. Detectives speak about it in training sessions, during late-night shifts, over burnt coffee and flickering fluorescent lights. They talk about how close they were, how far they drifted, how one overlooked detail can outlive careers. One investigator, newly assigned to the cold case unit, requests the file, not because she doubts the conviction, but because she wants to understand the anatomy of failure. She flips through reports yellowed with age, photographs that look older than they should, witness statements typed on machines that no longer exist. She traces the timeline, noting where urgency faded into routine, where assumptions replaced evidence. The anonymous tip still haunts her. Not the content, but the timing. Why then? Why not earlier? She learns that answers to those questions are rarely found in files. They live in people. She starts asking questions, informally, carefully. Retired officers, former clerks, a lab technician who once worked the midnight shift. Each conversation reveals fragments of a system under pressure, stretched thin by understaffing, budget cuts, shifting priorities. No villain, just erosion. The city's relationship with the case continues to evolve. For some, it becomes proof that justice works, even if it stumbles. For others, it exposes how easily justice can be delayed, how fragile certainty really is. Public trust doesn't break cleanly. It fractures. A documentary crew arrives one summer, chasing the success story angle. Solve cold case. Anonymous tip. Forgotten evidence. Redemption arc. They film exterior shots of the courthouse, the street, the police station. They interview officials who speak in careful soundbites, balancing pride with caution. The victim's family declines to participate. They have learned that telling their story publicly does not lighten its weight. It multiplies it. Their grief does not need a soundtrack. The filmmakers push forward anyway, shaping the narrative into something palatable, something with momentum. They leave out the long silences, the years where nothing happened, the nights when hope felt irresponsible. The finished product airs to respectable ratings. Viewers feel satisfied. Closure sells. But closure, like justice, is not evenly distributed. In prison, the convicted man ages faster than time predicts. Decades collapse into routines measured by counts, meals, lights-out schedules. He files fewer appeals now. The language of his motions grows thinner, more desperate. He writes letters that go unanswered, convinced that someone, somewhere, will eventually see what he insists others missed. Sometimes he almost believes his own version completely. Other times, memory breaks through with sharp clarity, uninvited, unfiltered. He wakes up sweating, the Florida heat replaced by the stale air of his cell, unsure which version of himself frightens him more. The anonymous tip remains a mystery, but rumors circulate. Some say it was a former friend. Others believe it was a family member burdened by guilt. The uncertainty fuels speculation, but no confirmation ever comes. The tipster vanishes back into anonymity, their voice echoing without a face. Cold case units across the country cite the Florida case in conferences and seminars. It becomes a slide in a PowerPoint presentation, a lesson distilled into bullet points. Preserve evidence. Revisit assumptions. Listen to delayed witnesses. Each lesson sounds obvious in hindsight, but hindsight is a luxury investigators rarely have. The detective who originally reopened the case retires quietly, declining his ceremony. He leaves behind a desk cleared of personal items, a drawer containing copies of old notes he never quite let go of. On his last day, he walks past the evidence room one final time, nodding to the younger officers inside. He knows better than anyone that evidence is patient. It waits longer than people can imagine. Outside the system, the victim's family navigates a strange emotional plateau. The intensity of waiting is gone, replaced by something harder to define. Relief mixes with sorrow. Validation collides with absence. They no longer fight for recognition, but they also no longer know what to fight for. Anniversaries still hurt. Holidays still carry an empty chair. Justice did not restore what was taken. It only named what happened. One family member begins writing privately at first. Journals filled with fragments, memories, questions never asked. Writing becomes a way to organize pain without explaining it. Eventually, pieces are shared with others who understand. A quiet community forms, bound not by answers, but by endurance. The city moves on, but traces remain. A mural appears near the old street, not officially connected to the case, but unmistakably influenced by it. Abstract shapes, dark blues and oranges. No names, just a feeling. People stop and stare without knowing why. Late one night, a patrol officer responds to a routine call nearby. Nothing serious. Noise complaint. As he waits in his car, he glances down the street, illuminated by the same sodium vapor lights that once shone on flashing police tape. He feels a chill that has nothing to do with temperature. He doesn't know the details of the 1992 case. He only knows the outline, enough to sense that some places absorb what happens to them. Back at headquarters, a new cold case file is opened. Different year, different victim, similar uncertainty. The cycle continues, but it carries the weight of experience now. Investigators approach it with caution shaped by past failure, optimism tempered by reality. The Solved Florida case does not promise success. It offers warning. Years later, when the case is referenced again, it is no longer called a miracle. It is called persistence. The anonymous tip is described not as luck, but as inevitability delayed by silence. The city, older now, bears its history unevenly. Some scars fade, others deepen, but the knowledge remains, circulating quietly. The past is never truly past, and the truth, once buried, is rarely content to stay there forever. As night falls, Florida hums with the sound of insects and distant traffic. Somewhere, in a file room, a solved cold case rests among unsolved ones, its presence a reminder, its silence heavy. The story does not end. It simply pauses, waiting for the next moment when time, memory, and truth collide again. Time keeps moving, but does not smooth the edges of what happened. It sharpens them. Distance does not dilute memory in this city. It concentrates it, compressing years into moments that surface without warning. The Florida heat still presses down at night, thick and unrelenting, as if the air itself refuses to forget. Long after the headlines fade, the solved cold case continues to ripple outward in ways no one predicted. It changes how people speak, how they hesitate before trusting assumptions, how they listen when someone finally decides to talk. Silence, once mistaken for peace, is now recognized as something else entirely. In the police department, a new generation of detectives grows up under the shadow of the case. They weren't alive in 1992. They never walked the original crime scene. Yet the story is embedded in their training, whispered during night shifts, referenced when evidence feels thin and pressure feels heavy. The case becomes less about what happened and more about how easily truth can be delayed. A young detective studies the old photographs again late one night. He knows the verdict, knows the confession that came later, knows the evidence that sealed it. But he focuses on the early days, the first hours after the murder. He notices small things others missed: body language and witness statements, timing gaps, the absence of urgency in certain follow-ups. He understands, now, how momentum can slip away quietly. This awareness changes how he works. He pushes harder. He double-checks. He refuses to close doors simply because they are inconvenient to reopen. The Florida cold case becomes his cautionary ghost, hovering just behind every decision. Outside law enforcement, the case continues to live a strange second life. Online forums dissect it endlessly, some seeking understanding, others chasing controversy. The anonymous tip is elevated to myth. The forgotten fingerprint becomes symbolic, proof that the smallest detail can outlive decades of neglect. Speculation spirals. New theories emerge, despite the conviction. Alternative timelines. Hidden accomplices. Cover-ups that exist only because uncertainty attracts imagination. The internet does not respect finality. The victim's family learns to tune it out, but complete detachment is impossible. Their loved one's name surfaces in places it shouldn't, spoken by strangers with confidence unearned by grief. They remind themselves that curiosity is not cruelty, even when it feels invasive. They have learned something else, too. Justice does not erase pain. It reorganizes it. One family member returns to the old neighborhood for the first time in years. The street looks smaller than memory allowed. Trees are taller. Houses wear new paint. The space where police cars once crowded feels unremarkable now, almost disappointingly normal. That normalcy hurts more than decay would have. They stand there quietly, listening to distant traffic, feeling the weight of time press in both directions. This is where everything changed. This is where it never changed back. In prison, the convicted man marks another year gone. The appeal process has slowed to a crawl, reduced to procedural motions and rejected filings. His world has shrunk to routine and memory. He tells himself that time has been unfair, that the past has been misinterpreted, that the evidence tells a story incomplete without him controlling the narrative. But the truth intrudes when he least expects it, in dreams, in smells, in the sudden sound of metal doors closing. He cannot fully escape the version of himself frozen in 1992, no matter how much he insists on distance. The anonymous tipster remains absent, but their decision continues to reverberate. Other people, watching from the margins, take notice. Tips begin arriving in unrelated cases, some credible, some misguided, all driven by the same realization. Silence is a choice, and choices have consequences. Detectives adapt. They learn to treat late information not as suspect, but as potentially crucial. Time, they realize, does not invalidate truth. It only complicates it. The Florida case influences policy in quiet ways. Evidence rooms are audited more frequently. Cold case reviews become systematic rather than occasional. Departments invest in technology that didn't exist in 1992, not as a miracle cure, but as a safeguard against forgetting. Yet technology cannot replace judgment. That lesson lingers. A conference on unsolved crimes features the case as a discussion point, stripped of names, presented as a timeline of decisions. Attendees debate what should have happened, what could have been done differently. The conversation is respectful but tense. No one wants to imagine their own cases dissected this way decades later. The case also reshapes public expectations. People become less patient with unresolved crimes, less willing to accept shrugs and explanations that lean too heavily on time. Pressure mounts on departments to revisit old files, to justify inaction, to acknowledge uncertainty. This pressure is uncomfortable, but necessary. Justice, the Florida case proves, does not thrive in complacency. Late one evening, a journalist revisits the story for an anniversary piece. They approach it differently this time, less interested in sensational details and more focused on the waiting. The long, empty years, the unanswered questions, the human cost of delay. The article is quieter, heavier, and strangely more impactful. Readers respond not with outrage, but with reflection. They see themselves in the timeline, realize how easily life can move forward while truth stands still. The victim's name, printed again, feels less like a headline and more like a reminder. In the police department, a cold case review board convenes to examine another unsolved file from the same era. The similarities are unsettling. Lost leads, incomplete follow-ups, witnesses who drifted away. The Florida case hovers in the room as they speak, an uninvited but necessary presence. They decide to reopen the file. It doesn't guarantee answers. It guarantees effort. Years after the conviction, the street where the murder occurred is quiet at night. Porch lights glow softly. Crickets fill the air. Someone walks a dog past the house without knowing why the place feels heavier than it should. They shrug it off and keep moving. But places remember. The solved cold case does not fade into irrelevance. It becomes a reference point, a warning, a reluctant teacher. It reminds everyone who touches it that justice is not a single act, but a chain of decisions stretched across time. And time, as Florida has learned, is not an ally. It is a test. As another year closes, the case sits firmly in the record books, labeled and cataloged. Yet its influence remains active, shaping how people listen, how they question, how they resist the comfort of forgetting. The story is no longer about whether the crime was solved. It is about what solving it revealed. That waiting has weight. That silence has power. And that truth, even buried for decades, has a way of demanding air. The city breathes in the humid night, carrying its history forward, aware now that nothing truly disappears. It only waits, patient and persistent, for the moment someone is finally willing to look back. There is a moment, long after the courtroom's empty and the microphones are turned off, when a solved case stops belonging to the system and begins to belong to time itself. It drifts into the collective memory of the city, not as a finished story, but as a lingering presence. Florida carries that presence quietly now, like humidity you no longer comment on because it never truly leaves. Years after the cold case is officially closed, people still lower their voices when they talk about it. Not out of fear of the killer. He is already contained, but out of respect for what the case represents. A reminder that certainty is fragile. That truth can be delayed without being destroyed. That justice is not guaranteed by effort alone. In police archives, the file rests in a climate-controlled room, boxed and labeled, its weight measured in paper and evidence bags. New cases arrive every week, demanding attention, demanding urgency. But occasionally, a detective pauses while passing the shelf, glancing at the familiar case number. Not because there is more to solve, but because there is more to remember. They remember how close it came to vanishing. The Florida 1992 cold case is now used as a training scenario, reconstructed step by step for those just entering the profession. Recruits sit in classrooms under fluorescent lights, unaware of how much emotion still clings to the facts they're studying. They analyze decisions made by people long retired, some deceased. They are asked what they would have done differently. Some answers are confident. Others are hesitant. The instructors listen carefully, knowing there is no perfect response, only awareness. Outside those walls, life moves on in visible ways. New businesses replace old storefronts. Roads are widened. Landmarks disappear. The city reinvents itself, as cities always do. Yet beneath the surface, the memory of the crime remains embedded, like an old fault line that never quite seals. For the victim's family, time has rearranged their grief into something quieter, but no less real. Birthdays pass. Holidays arrive and leave. New generations are born who will only know the victim through stories and photographs. Justice did not restore what was taken, but it changed how they carry the loss. They have learned that closure is not a door that shuts. It is a space you learn to live inside. Sometimes, late at night, one of them still replays the years before the arrest. The phone calls unanswered. The detectives who meant well, but ran out of options. The feeling of being suspended in a moment that refused to resolve. Those memories do not vanish simply because the case is solved. They coexist with the relief, tangled and inseparable. The anonymous tip remains the most haunting element of all. No name, no face, just a decision made at the right moment. The tipster's silence afterward becomes part of the story, raising questions no one can answer. Were they afraid? Relieved? Haunted by what they knew? Or were they simply finished? That uncertainty resonates deeply with others who hold pieces of truth in unrelated cases. The Florida cold case becomes an example whispered in interviews and public campaigns. Someone spoke, and everything changed. Not immediately, not easily, but definitively. It alters behavior in small ways. A witness hesitates, then picks up the phone. A relative reconsiders a long-kept secret. A former acquaintance finally admits what they saw decades ago. Not every tip leads to justice, but the silence is thinner now. The legal system absorbs the case as precedent. Motions cite it. Appeals reference its timeline. Arguments are built around the idea that evidence can survive neglect. That time alone does not invalidate proof. The cold case reshapes how delay is interpreted. Yet it also exposes a harsher truth. Many cases will never receive this second chance. For every forgotten murder reopened, countless others remain buried beneath missing files, deceased witnesses, and eroded evidence. The Florida case is not a promise. It is an exception, and exceptions are dangerous if mistaken for rules. A veteran detective, now retired, reflects on this late one evening. He remembers working similar cases in the early 90s when technology was limited and resources were stretched thin. He remembers the pressure to prioritize solvable crimes, the quiet acceptance that some answers would never come. The Florida case unsettles him because it proves that acceptance was not always justified. He wonders how many families are still waiting, unaware that a single overlooked detail might still exist somewhere, dormant but intact. The thought lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved. In the community, the case resurfaces during conversations about trust. Trust in institutions. Trust in memory. Trust in the idea that doing the right thing eventually matters. The story is used to argue both sides. Faith rewarded or failure narrowly redeemed. Both interpretations are valid. The city's relationship with the case evolves from shock to contemplation. It is no longer a source of fear, but of caution. Parents mention it to teenagers when discussing safety, not to frighten them, but to explain how quickly ordinary days can fracture. Journalists revisit the archives again, not for breaking news, but for understanding. They read between lines once overlooked. They interview people who were never asked questions the first time around. The narrative deepens, moving beyond crime into consequence. The Florida cold case becomes less about a murderer and more about a system under strain. In prison, the man convicted ages quietly. His story, once sensational, is now rarely discussed. He occupies a different kind of silence, one enforced and inescapable. Whether he feels remorse or resentment no longer matters to the public. The damage is done. The verdict stands. What remains relevant is not him, but the years before his arrest. The long stretch when the case existed as an open wound, neither healing nor closing, just waiting. That waiting defines the legacy. As another decade approaches, Florida looks different on the surface, but the past remains close. The solved cold case is cited during policy debates, funding discussions, and public forums. It becomes shorthand for why patience must coexist with persistence. Why giving up too early carries consequences that ripple outward for generations. Late one night, the street where it all began is empty again. The same stillness, the same quiet. But now, unlike before, there's an awareness layered over the silence. A knowledge that the truth did not disappear. It endured. That knowledge does not comfort everyone. For some, it raises new questions. For others, it offers a fragile kind of hope. The Florida 1992 cold case no longer asks who committed the crime. It asks something harder. How many truths are still waiting? And how long will it take before someone decides to speak?